Okay, audio and video okay for all of you guys? Can you hear me? All right, we are all set. So this is another one, the third in our series of Dip into the Drips. There are a lot of remedies that are quite complex substances that are made from aqua sources. And this is another one of them. And you're looking at an advertisement for medical lake soap. I'm going to show you another one now. Sorry, I know these are not politically correct, but here's what we got. I'm going to share with you a little bit about Medical Lake and its history, because Skookumchuk is another one of those remedies where it's pretty hard for us to source it again. The conditions that were true in 1889 are no longer true in that water source. And so it brings up questions of how do we carry on with remedies that have huge potential and questionable reproduction. So this remedy is sourced from a lake that is now called Medical Lake, and it's near Spokane in Western Washington. There's actually another lake that's pretty close to there as well that's called Soap Lake, and both of them had relatively similar mineral composition and history. So what was written about this lake in the 1880s is that the water was kind of an amber brownish color, and it shone red in the sunlight, which would suggest what kinds of minerals? What would give it a reddish color? Iron, right. Copper. Copper often shows green, but it can. Different kinds of cadmium can also give a red color. Different kinds of algae can give a red color. So it certainly wasn't your basic blue lake like what we would expect to see. It was fed by two different springs and it had no outlet. So, the water would come in, the water would evaporate out, the water would come in, the water would evaporate out, which allowed for it to concentrate the minerals that were coming in from these two springs. And the First Nations people at that time called it Skookumchuk, which meant strong medicine water. And that eventually got translated into Skookumchuk. And it was considered sacred ground. The legend about it is that no matter how much enmity there was between warring tribes, nobody got attacked when they were getting water from the lake, because it was sacred ground and it was sacred space, and people came there to be healed and to get water for those in their tribe that needed healing. So the Indians would place the sick on a little bed over hot stones, and they would splash water from the lake onto the stones of the sick person so that they would get the steam. Now, this makes me wonder if this is one of those remedies that would act well in a process of, in the way that Boriki taught that we could give ferrum phos in hot water as a way of dosing and drinking it. It may be that Skookumchuk would also be that way. Patricia, you have your hand up. Do you have a comment? Do you want to put something in the chat? Or you're just saying hi? Okay. All right. So when the settlers came and basically hijacked the property around it, the land around it, one of the people who bought about a quarter of the area around the lake was an entrepreneur British guy named Stanley Hallett. And he had heard of this. There was a French Canadian who had come there, and he had sheep that he said had been healed by the water of the lake, and that he had had terrible rheumatism that had been healed by the water of the lake. And so he homesteaded there. And when Stanley Hallett came, the two of them began to talk about it, and Hallett began to boil the water to get the residue, and then started selling the salt as a patent medicine therapeutic. And this was in the late 1870s, early 1880s. And then people used to take the salt and make it into soap. So when you read old cases of this, very often they are asking the client to take the remedy and to also use the soap. And it was called medical lake soap. That's the picture that you're looking at there. If you look at the actual content of the lake, the mineral content is about 63% nat carb, 16% nat mur, 10% natrum silicata. So like 90% of the lake is sodium mineral content of some sort. And then about 9% of it is a potassium chloride. And then there's traces of a bunch of other minerals: lithium carb, Kali-sulf, mag carb, ferrum, calc carb, aluminum. All of those other guys are in there. Now, when Hallett began to sell the salts, he did a lot of promotion, and the soap was actually sold at the Chicago World's Fair. And it was a very big deal, and it attracted a lot of attention, and a lot of people found benefit from it. So that brought the attention of homeopaths. And there was a homeopath named Gentry who published a proving that he completed in 1889. He got some of the salt from Hallett, which was the evaporated water from the lake, and he potentized it himself into a 1x, a 2x, a 3x, and a 6x preparation. He started with doses of the 1x and immediately had severe sneezing and running nose that was like the worst hay fever you've ever had. And then it became this really strong catarrhal blockage that was so severe that he had to stop the proving. And he used the 1x during the proving, and then he used the 3x and 6x to give to other people for severe hay fever later, which very much helped him. Now, he says that when the proving was so terrible that he couldn't endure it, that he antidoted it with tobacco. But we don't know if he did that in gross form or actually tobacco as a remedy is antidotal to it. We don't know, and we can't dig him up and ask him. So the published cases, once he had put this information out there, because it was widely available, it was something that was all over the US in pharmacies and places where people sold patent medicines, and there were ads for it in the newspapers so anybody could buy it. So then the homeopathic pharmacies started making it. Practitioners started using it. In general, in the dosing, they talk about giving 1 grain or 2 grains or 5 grains of a 2x or 3x or 6x potency. Now, a grain is a mass measurement from the Bronze Age when an actual grain of barley or a grain of wheat was considered to be a valid transaction. It was a legal transaction. So 1 grain is equal to 1/16 of a gram. And a piece of paper, a regular size piece of paper, weighs 77 grains. So when you read about 1 grain, it's a really small amount, the amount of powder that would be equivalent to the weight of a wheat berry or a barley grain. And in addition to having their clients wash with the soap, and they would take these powders that was 1 grain or 2 grain of, say, 3x or something, and they would have them dump it into a glass of water, stir it, and take a teaspoon of the water. So they had everybody rehydrate it before they used it, which makes us think of what we talked about with the Aqua Marina, where Quinton said that it was much more effective when it was in liquid form than in dried form. This also makes me think if an appropriate way to use this would be to put it in water and add hot water that would create some steam, maybe not boiling because we know that hot water destroys things. But if you're working with 6X and you put it in hot water and have somebody breathe the steam, I think that could also be a very effective way of dosing for this. And that's what I've done for myself and with some of my clients that have had good outcomes, particularly with hay fever. So how do we learn to understand this remedy? One of the techniques of learning materia medica that I took on from Lynn Amara, who was one of my main teachers, was an approach that she taught us called triangulation. And you would pick 3 remedies that were in some way similar, and the new remedy sat kind of in the middle of those. So I'm going to share with you today 3 cases and 3 remedies that will help you begin to understand Skookumchuk. And then we'll talk about obtaining and dosing and references. Okay? Everybody okay so far? Questions? Okay. Most of the cases appear to involve skin issues, and Boricki writes about it as a great anti-psoric. Now, you can imagine with the mineral content that it has, but, you know, think about it. When they were measuring the mineral content of the water in the 1880s, they weren't looking at what the algae was or what any other kind of microflora might have been. So we've only got the mineral kingdom side of the story. We don't have anything fungal, any other microflora in there, but we can be confident that there was some content there, and that some of that would also be in the dried residue. So one of the first cases that was published was a case of a young girl who was 12 years old with severe urticaria. She had hives, bad cases of hives. And she had been given apis and urtica urins and other typical things. And she was given Skookumchuk in a 2x or 3x potency, which immediately resolved. Now, one of my ways of thinking about this is that I have seen often in my practice people who had some kind of thyroid disruption get problems with urticaria, and there's a known link there. Sometimes this happens right at puberty, sometimes it happens right at menopause, sometimes it happens at other kinds of hormonal shifts. It makes me wonder if this girl who was 12 was going into that stage. Does it have a thyroid affinity? I would be kind of, with the mineral content that it has, I'd be kind of surprised if it didn't. Okay. But most of the rest of the skin cases that are published involve a buildup of dead skin, of cracking. There's a very dramatic case of a woman who couldn't walk on her feet because she had buildup of dead tissue that was like half an inch thick with these huge crevices that were oozing this viscid desquamation. So what does that sound like? Thick skin, cracking, oozing, thick discharge. Any ideas? Graphites. Yes, thank you, Rose. Petroleum. Graphites. So I would, on one corner of my triangle, I would put the carbon series. If you think of the softest form of the carbons down there in carb, and then you move up into graphites and anthrococali, and then we get into, petroleums and all the way down to diamond, the hardened end of that carbon scale. This would be one corner of the triangle that will help you remember about Skookumchuk. And there are many cases of this with psoriasis, with eczema. And one of the other things that several of the cases mention is that they would advise the client to get an ointment, Skookumchuk ointment. And you can actually buy this online from some of the Indian pharmacies. It's a 3x potency. And what the old homeopaths would do is add 1 dram of the Skookumchuk 3x powder. 1 dram is like 1/8 of a fluid ounce. It's 60 grams. It's about the weight of 2/3 of 1 sheet of paper. And they would put 1 dram of Skookumchuk, like in a 2x or 3x, in with 1 ounce of Vaseline, which we get our petroleum right there. And they would mix it up, and they would have the client apply that on the broken out skin. And these were cracked, scabbing, oozing. This is like severe eczema that we are unlikely to see in extremis in that way, because we live in the land of topical steroid creams, and nobody's going to let it get that bad. So we might not see it in extremis like this, but when we see the buildup of lots of dead tissue, that is a red flag that says it could be very appropriate for Skookumchuk. All right, now let's look at that through another lens. How many of you are familiar with salicylic acid as a product that's used for acne, for exfoliation? Yes? And do you remember what salicylic acid, what's it sourced from? Where do we get salicylic acid from? White willow, yes. And aspirin is another salicylic acid product that's also sourced from bark of white willow. So this is derived from bark of white willow. Salicylic acid is a second corner of the triangle. When there is incredible exudate and buildup that needs to be relieved, salicylic acid in a gel or a cream or a wash is used herbally all the time. And there are many, many products like this on the market. As a homeopathic remedy, it can also be very effective. And I've used it with eczema, with psoriasis, when there was this strong buildup of plaques of tissue that's really thick. So this is a second corner on our triangle. Another published case of Skookumchuk is of a woman who had a lump in her left breast that was the size of a walnut. It was benign. She had no history of cancer, and she had no history at all of tuberculosis in a way that you might think would create nodules. So she was given Skookumchuk. And we're going to talk about this case just a little bit because almost all of the old homeopaths used a similar approach in these cases that were published in the journals in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s. They would give the person a certain number of powders, and they would have them take the powder, dump it into a glass of water, stir it, take a teaspoon as their dose. So their powder for the first week might be a 1x. And they would take a teaspoon 4 times a day, or 6 times a day if it was severe, or once a day, some number of times a day. And the second week, they would go to 2x, or 2 weeks later, they would go to 2x, or after the next follow-up, they would go to 2x. And then a period of time later, they would go to 3x. And they, in the same way that Hahnemann has us working with LMs, LM1, then move up to LM2, then move up to LM3. And so this successive graduation is something that we see written into many, many, many of these cases. And this is what I've done when I've used this remedy and the approach that I would recommend for you guys. Now, I don't know of anywhere that you can get a 1x or a 2x. You can buy 3x from the Indian pharmacies. You can buy 6x from Helios Pharmacy and 12x. So doing something like 3x, 6x, 12x is something that I've done that's worked. Another thing that you can do is get the 6x and potentize it yourself into a 7, an 8, a 9. You can get the 3x and potentize it yourself into a 4x, a 5x, a 6x. Using these gradual steps in this remedy seems to be extremely effective. Now, in the case of this woman with the lump in her breast, she was given the increasing gradual doses. This could likely have been a plugged milk duct or a lymph gland that was hardened. And given the amount of natrum, the silicate, the content of it, you can imagine that that would have helped break up whatever that was. There are several authors that refer to Skookumchuk Aqua as a remedy with lithemic diathesis. And lithemic is another word for uric acid. So for people who have the tendency to form stones, rocks in their body, and have mucosal catarrh, that's the pattern that you're looking for. So if I saw somebody who had eczema and they didn't have any history of sinus stuff, mucosal catarrh, they didn't have any history for themselves or their family of stones being created anywhere, no family history of gout, I probably would look elsewhere. But if those things were present, I would seriously be thinking about this remedy. And I have used this as an adjunct where the case in psoriasis looked like Staphysagria. So I have them on Staphysagria in the evening before bed with their LM dose or whatever they're taking. And then in the morning when they get up, they take their dose of Skookumchuk 1X. I believe that we get a big benefit from the or 3X or whatever. They get the benefit of the closeness to the actual mineral content. Okay, so one side of our triangle to learn Skookumchuk, which is in the middle, is our carbon series, especially graphites, petroleum, calc carb. And then we move over to the next triangle, and it's the salicylic acid with all the layered buildup. At the top of our triangle is another mineral remedy, gunpowder. There are several published cases of someone who had an abscess that was very long-standing, months. And in the resolution of it, they had tried all kinds of different remedies that had not helped. And they used Skookumchuk both as an oral dose and as a topical wash. And it cleared the abscesses very quickly and allowed the skin to heal without scarring or distortion. So this is another, one of the other remedies that we use frequently for abscesses is gunpowder. So if you draw yourself a triangle where you've got the carbon series down in one corner, particularly graphites and petroleum, and in the other corner, you've got salicylic acid. And in the top, you've got gunpowder. And you think about the ways and overlaps of all those things, that will give you a really solid view of Skookumchuk. Okay, let's now talk about availability of this remedy. The medical lake became very popular. And so there were bathhouses and guest houses that were built. And in the 1880s and 90s, what was the plan for sewage disposal? What did you do? Where did it go? I don't think they really had the concept of septic tanks yet. It went in the lake. They dumped it all in the lake. And Stanley Hallett built a huge mansion that's actually still there today. And all of the waste and garbage all went into the lake, which then created these big stinky algae blooms, and it caused a lot of problems. So people stopped going to the lake, and it basically ruined business. Stanley Hallett died in 1926 after several years of a rather nasty cancer. And because he had been the healthy guy with all this, that sort of put a pall on it too. And then the world sort of moved on. It's still called Medical Lake, but it's seen very much as an anachronism. And now there's houses all around the lake, and it's just a place where people live. So when we are using this remedy in 3x potency, how do you source that? For how long? How much of the original was around for anybody to work with? I have in one of the old homeopathic bottles from Borky and Taffel, I have Skookumchuk that, that was 2x, but I can't use it. It sat in a warehouse in Sacramento for decades in the heat. I'm sure that it will not be active and I would never use it. But how do we continue to source this? The amount needed to create 6x is more than the amount that we need to create a C remedy or an LM remedy. So I would encourage all of you guys to purchase it now in a 6x, in a 12x, work with it yourself and see. Question, how do you spell the lake remedy? The lake's name is Medical Lake, and the remedy is spelled, let me send this to everybody. Skookumchuk, Aqua. Now, there are actually in Washington State other places with special healing qualities. There's a Skookumchuk Valley and a Skookumchuk River that are south of Olympia, down toward Chehalis. But this particular source, Soap Lake and Medical Lake, are way out by Spokane. Eventually, they built a mental asylum right next to Medical Lake, and the whole area sort of went a different direction. I would really suggest that you investigate this, get a substance, get a source, team up with some buddies and order some of the 3X from India. For those of you who are in Australia, it's available from Angel's Pharmacy. For those of you who are in New Zealand, it's available from Similimum Pharmacy. For those of you who are, Remedia doesn't have it at all. The old homeopathic pharmacies in the US all used to have it because it was US sourced. Okay? We may get to a point where they can't make 3X or 6X anymore. So get some of this on hand. Okay? What do we think about this for thick cradle cap? Absolutely. What about for bone spurs? That's an interesting question, Richard. I would not think about it in that way unless there were also lots of stones and I was seeing that whole uric acid diathesis writ large. But I would be more likely to go with other tools for bone spurs because bone spurs are a different sort of disorder. Okay, that's it, guys. Thank you so much for the time that you invest day by day and week by week in studying homeopathy and for the time that you put into learning. It's a blessing to you and it's a blessing to everybody that you're ever going to help, your friends, your family, your clients, your colleagues. All right, be well. Bye-bye.